It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Ken Starr, and we're going to be discussing his brand new book, Religious Liberty in Crisis: Exercising Your Faith in an Age of Uncertainty. Ken, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you, Shaun. So good to be with you.
Now, Ken, for people in my generation, I am a Gen Xer. We kind of grew up with you. We've seen you on TV throughout our lives. But the one thing I was thinking about getting ready for a conversation is I think for some of the millennials and people downwards generationally, they might not have yet encountered you. So I want to kick this off by having you share sort of that elevator pitch version of the Ken Starr origin story for somebody encountering you for the first time. What are a few things they should know about you?
Well, thank you, Shaun. Again, thanks so much for having me on. I'm a sixth generation Texan, and I'm back in my native state of Texas, and thankful for that. And I'm a preacher's kid, PK, but I never got arrested. In trouble from time to time, but went off to a Christian college, did not get kicked out, but felt, I was really guided by my large public high school in San Antonio counselor. Go East, young man. So I went to Washington, D.C., worked on Capitol Hill to work my way through George Washington University, went to graduate school thinking I'd be a college teacher, to Brown University. Notice these are both Baptist colleges. Did you know that? George Washington was founded by Baptists in the 1820s. Brown was a Baptist college, university. Then uh, felt, no, I don't think that is my calling. I just felt increasingly called to the law, went to the Duke Law School, a Methodist school. And then my career in the law, very simply and briefly, is I was so blessed to be guided. We all need mentors in life. And I was mentored to apply for, and I received, by God's grace, a federal judgeship clerkship. One thing led to another. I was privileged to clerk on the Supreme Court of the United States for Chief Justice Berger, a great friend of religious freedom. And then professionally, I've been both in private practice and in public life. I was in the Reagan administration as chief of staff to Attorney General William French Smith. I was a federal judge in Washington, D.C., on the same court that Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia served on. I served with them both back in the 1980s. But I came to, shall I say, some infamy after I left the Solicitor General's office. I left the court, was returning to the Justice Department as Solicitor General, and served under President George Herbert Walker Bush, 41, as we came to call him. And then after that, returned to private law practice, but was tapped to become independent counsel. And that's how I became a little bit, for better or for worse, better known during the Clinton administration and involved in the impeachment of President Clinton. Then I returned to private practice and then into higher education, ironically, after my Brown University decision to leave the possibility of college teaching. I became dean of the Pepperdine Law School, which is a wonderful Christian university in Malibu, California. Then president of Baylor University here in Texas, a Baptist university, welcoming to everyone. And then left. And since that time in 2016, almost 5 years ago, I have been both practicing law and writing and lecturing and being involved in Christian organizations such as the Christian Legal Society and a wonderful group that focuses on international religious freedom called Advocates International. So and I've just gone on the board of trustees of Regent University in Virginia Beach.
Well, with that being an elevator pitch version of your story, you got us up at least, I think, 10 stories. So that was really great.
Okay.
Well, I guess one last question I would just ask surrounded your story out. I'm always curious, in terms of you feeling called into the legal practice, was it a mentor? Was it a book? What was it that kind of highlighted that calling and pushed you in that direction? I'm always curious how that happens for somebody.
It was a confluence of factors, but one of the catalysts was the fact that at Brown, as much as I loved my professors and so forth, I just saw the direction of political science, my chosen field, was becoming very quantitative. And I was more interested in issues such as political philosophy and so forth. And then a key catalyst was taking a course, which was required of all graduate students, constitutional law. And boom, the light went off, epiphanies and lighthouses and all sorts of things. I said, I think this is what I'm called to do.
Yeah, when we step into that place that is our calling, or might we say our destiny, it is like those light bulbs go off and we're like, where has this been my whole life? My brain works this way. Clearly, this is what I'm supposed to do. Well, let's get now into we've got your backstory. Let's step into the story behind the book. As a guy who works in publishing, I'm ever curious why somebody would go down the path of writing on a particular topic. Obviously, 2020 was an interesting year. We had a pandemic, we've had racial tensions, and everything in between and imaginable. So, in terms of the climate, this is a very important book, but also a very interesting book to write and publish. So, what made you feel like this was the season for this book to come to life?
The pandemic itself, and suddenly we were in, as our British cousins call it, lockdown. And so lots of plans were scuttled. And I found myself having more time to reflect. And I've always felt this call, going back 40 years, to speak into the issue of religious freedom as our foundational freedom. So the opportunity came in terms of flexibility of schedule, and then what I saw as a pressing cultural need.
And in terms of the season we're in right now, there's other things I want to unpack. But if you had to define maybe the biggest threats to religious liberty, like right now and on the horizon, maybe in the next 2 years, what are some of the things that you'd say have you concerned?
There are two closely related forces. One, the forces of government, and we've seen that, haven't we, in terms of lockdowns of churches. You can't gather more than X number. You know, where two or three are gathered together, the Lord is with us. But maybe more than two or three want to gather together, and they should be able to. And so I was in anguish when I saw the church closing cases in the Supreme Court struggling with it. And I was writing the book during that period, during the pandemic period. But the second thing is the embittering of the culture more broadly against religious faith and practice. So we see these unfortunate trends, church membership or affiliation with any formal religious institution continuing to decline, historic levels. We should be concerned about that. But I think even more, at least that people making up their own minds, that's freedom, right? And you might hope and pray that no, they would find a church community, a religious house for society's well-being. One of the things that just continues to come to mind, the words at the founding in the very first Congress of the United States, the Northwest Ordinance governing Illinois, governing Ohio and Indiana, the heartland, provided specifically a really clarion call for religious faith and practice. Religion generally was seen as good for society. Indeed, the words of the Northwest Ordinance are very telling. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Notice the three pillars: religion, morality, and knowledge, in order for there to be human flourishing, economic prosperity, but even more, a civil society where we live in peace and harmony with one another, in the words of the preamble to America's Constitution, domestic tranquility. We love tranquility, right? It hurts us, it enrages us, righteous indignation to see individuals supposedly asserting rights and then tearing down the businesses and burning the businesses of innocent people, even if they were somehow culpable, to take the law into their hands that way, and then for law enforcement to allow this to go on, for city leadership to allow this to go on. And yet, when it comes to religious faith and practice, government rises up in righteous indignation and says, how dare you have that home Bible study? So I see these very, very worrisome trends. And I think that my book is speaking into these trends, but with a message of hope. I outlined six great principles. I call them great because they're both large and they're very, very good principles. Six great principles of religious freedom, which enjoy enormous support in our law, in our constitutional history, in our constitutional traditions, and at times, even in the modern day court, get 9 votes in favor of these great principles. So there's hope. We need to inform ourselves. Part of you talk about Generation X. I think the baby boomers, boom, guilty as about to be church. We failed adequately culturally to transmit the faith and to transmit faith in American institution. We have allowed the culture to turn sour and negative on the whole idea of what America is. And yet, I love quoting Frederick Douglass. He had lived in slavery. He spoke with authority. Scripture says he spoke with authority and not as the scribes. And what Frederick Douglass called the genius of America's institutions. That's a slave who escaped from the bondages of Pharaoh, as it were, and who could still praise America's institutions. We should reflect on what Mr. Lincoln said, a new birth of freedom after the Civil War. We should reflect on the words of Frederick Douglass. We should reflect on the reality that thousands of people are seeking entry into the United States, including illegally. Whereas I don't know a whole lot of people who are saying, I think I better move to Venezuela or even Canada, or I'm moving to Mexico. I'm getting out of the little sweet land of liberty. I've had enough. No, people are moving to Texas and to South Carolina and Florida, but they're not leaving the country, even if they've had it with California and New York, high taxes and all the rest of the lamentations, which I think are very serious. I love California. I lived in California for 6 years, and I cry for California. I cry for New York, which I love. I love the city of New York. And yet, here's one of the cases on religious freedom, which happily the Supreme Court came to the rescue just in time for Christmas and Hanukkah and said, that's it, Governor Cuomo. You've gone too darn far. We're going to strike a mighty blow for religious liberty. That's what this book, if I may hold it up, is all about.
One of the things I wrote down in my notes as I was getting ready for the interview was the word autonomy. And you talk about in the book that autonomy is the key to religious liberty. I feel like that's one of the things that was just crushed last year, or that we're just all supposed to forget about. So, for somebody who doesn't quite understand what that term means, talk to us about what that means and why it's really critical in this discussion for religious freedom.
Right. It means Caesar, Herod, Agrippa, Pharaoh, hands off. You don't enter here. And the entering here is the business of churches and church affiliated organizations, including schools. And the good news in this principle of essentially emancipation, we govern ourselves. We have to obey certain aspects of government to be sure, because we're citizens and pastors pay taxes and so forth. But we enjoy tax exemptions as churches and so forth. But we enjoy autonomy in terms of how we're organized and who we hire and who we fire. And in the example I give, which every person who cares about religion in America should be aware of, is a real life case. You don't have to go to law school. Real life case in calling a Christian school. The Obama EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, said we can step in and tell you, no, you cannot fire that teacher. And the Supreme Court of the United States unanimously said EEOC and Obama administration, Justice Department, you were wrong. Now, I said a very important word, unanimously. We said, well, when was that? That must have been a century. No, I said the Obama administration and the justices who agreed with the proposition of autonomy, of independence, Caesar hands off, included Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Stephen Breyer. We, of course, bade farewell to Justice Ginsburg. And by the way, part of the good news of what's been happening to on the church closing points and now church reopenings is Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who's already become a very strong pro-religious liberty was in that context. But that's back to the principle of autonomy. Leave the church schools alone. And the Supreme Court just reinforced that principle back in the summer before they departed for their summer recess. This time it was 7-2 in favor of autonomy, but it was frankly a harder case. It involved Catholic schools where the teachers didn't even have to be Roman Catholic. So how can you be a transmitter of the faith if you're not even a parishioner, right? If you're not even in the Roman Catholic Church, and yet even there, the Supreme Court by a 7-2 margin said, and Justice Ginsburg was in dissent. This was shortly before her death. But 7-2, a supermajority said autonomy. The church school gets to determine who it will hire and, more importantly, now, who it will fire.
One of the things I think I heard over and over again last year and also into this year is this phrase, it's for your own good. Talk to us about some of the ways that government entities can, they might have good intentions with the laws that they're passing, but how can they inadvertently sometimes overreach into religious liberty, even if they really mean well?
By treating a religious gathering as if it's a public lecture or a symphony, a concert, or what have you. And the irony, and it's not, because free exercise of religion is expressly protected by our Constitution. And what that means, and 170 pages, you'll understand this as a citizen. And that is government, if you're going to put a restriction on the church, you're going to have to pay a really high price in terms of convincing us, convince us judges that you have this compelling reason. Well, it's the pandemic, but that you've used the least narrow means, the least restrict, I mean, the most narrow means, the least restrictive means for achieving that public health goal. And that's where the arguments of the governors just fall apart. They absolutely collapse like a balloon. They cannot show that they will permit Walmart, or the worst case, I think, that came to the Supreme Court was Nevada, with the governor saying Caesar's Palace can operate at 50%, got to abide by social restrictions, but 50%. But churches are limited no matter how large the sanctuary, no matter how large the auditorium, the worship center, 50, 50. It was flatly unconstitutional as a violation of the free exercise of religion.
I think one of the interesting elements of last year is so many people became social media warriors, complaining and sharing and posting. But I feel like many of us weren't getting out and serving, kind of trying to step in like practical, meaningful, useful ways. So, in terms of protecting our rights of religious freedom, how can we, as concerned citizens, take more of an active role in advancing this cause of liberty that goes beyond just what we're posting online?
Yes. Well, first and foremost is education. It's like that founding generation said, we have to educate ourselves. We have to inform ourselves. So I hope that my book will serve as a tool for self-education. And then we are prepared to do what we can then, and I think this should not be overlooked, transmitting our values, our vision to the rising generation. So, this is a book, frankly, for grandparents, us baby boomers, who maybe failed, or we allowed the public schools to step in and not do what they should have been doing, which is honoring America's past. Of course, reform our institutions, make them better. We're all in favor of reform and making things better, but not scuttling them and saying they're bad, they're evil. So it's for grandparents, but it's also for homeschoolers. And to be honest, it's for parents of the public school students to say, I think, John, Mary, dear children, we need to have some supplemental learning here because I'm not sure of what you're learning in civics, if anything. And so we have a book here, and we're going to go through this together a chapter at a time. Then you're prepared to enter the marketplace of ideas. That might be a meeting of the school board. It might just be a cup of coffee with your member of the school board because it's not just Washington, D.C., it's now local communities that are doing things that are inimical to religious freedom. So, however one feels called, perhaps through one small group or a Wednesday night gathering, what are we going to talk about? Well, look at what the mayor just did. The mayor of Houston, some few years ago now, thankfully, we have a different mayor now. She actually subpoenaed through the city attorney pastors' notes for their sermons. Well, talk about dead on arrival. She didn't understand, I gather, the great principle of autonomy and freedom of conscience. Another one of we seem to have lost in the 21st century. There's been a huge erosion of public understanding as well now as public sympathy because the culture is saying religion is affirmatively bad because it's a mask for discrimination. We have to be able to respond to that and to use examples and great principles to convince people, even if they don't come along and say, I agree with you, at least they will, if they're people of goodwill and open-minded enough to say, I understand your perspective. And yeah, I disagree. Well, that's fine. We disagree over the supper table, right? Over things. Families disagree. But that's not the point to disagree. It is to be able to give a winsome and reasoned account of our great principles. And so the example I love to use is that of the Apostle Paul, Acts chapter 17 on Mars Hill or the Areopagus. And there, he's not condemning the pagan culture. He's not praising it, but he's leaning into it and speaking into it in a winsome way. I see you're a religious people. And now let me tell you about the hope that is within me. And some accepted, others did not. We can't pretend that we have such powerful arguments that everyone's going to be convinced. But we do have such powerful arguments grounded in history, grounded in our tradition, grounded in fundamental principles of who we are as a free people in a constitutional democracy. They'll have to say, you know what? They've got a point. I disagree, but they've got a point.
Yeah, I don't think we can overemphasize that idea of needing to transmit the stories of our country and the generations that came before and the good of our nation. And whether we've regardless of where that has broken down in the system, that baton needs to be picked up and run forward, and those stories of who we are as a people, as a nation, that needs to be transmitted to the generations that are up and coming, so they can feel good about who we are as a country, but also see how their story fits into the continuing unfolding story of America. I feel like if we don't know where we came from, it's really hard to know what we're supposed to do in the present, let alone where we're going in the future. So that reigniting of that story, I feel like that's so critical and so important. And I love that you're encouraging us not only to be concerned about what's happening at a national level, but also what's happening locally. The same charge I've given and related to churches, I would just give to the general citizen. Uh, Get outside of your house, get outside of the full four walls of the church, get to know your neighbors, get active in your community. If there are concerns about what's happening around you, don't just talk about it. Don't just stand up with a sign and protest it. Go love your neighbor, help people, make a difference. And that face to face interaction with those people in your community, that's what's going to change the world directly around you in your community. It's going to cost you time, it's going to cost you effort. But that is what I think will bring a real, tangible change in the immediate. It's we're not in a time to be dormant. It's a time to be active. Ken, one thing I want to make sure I have you comment on before we wrap up is kind of the problem of cancel culture. If there's one thing that came up last year, like we'd never seen it before, it was everything just needs to be canceled because everything's awful and evil. How do we push back? How do we respond to cancel culture? Because I feel like even if we try to respond, we're just canceled.
Yes, exactly right. Well, we have to, first of all, cleanse the temple of the money changer, so to speak. Now, we don't have the power to say to Jack Dorsey at Twitter, how dare you and so forth. And I'm going to start my own company here. That is happening. I mean, platforms are, in fact, being created. But we need to, first of all, inform ourselves about what cancel culture stands for. It stands for we want to suppress speech. So let's leave free exercise of religion aside. Cancel culture means I'm going to say your voice is not worth hearing, and therefore I cancel it. This is utterly inimical to who we are as a free people. And once again, and I speak to this in one of the chapters, even though it's not just on religious liberty, but the religious voices are among those being canceled. That what you are doing, and if you do it as public official, get ready because we'll see you in court. And you say, oh, that doesn't sound like a very Christian thing to do. Excuse me, but the Apostle Paul knew how to litigate because after Athens, comes the trip to Jerusalem. And then the rest of the book of Acts has to do with litigation and traveling to court called Caesar, right? And then in Caesar's household. And then all those wonderful, beautiful letters, the prison letters that the Apostle Paul wrote. But he was a litigator. He stood up. And how many times did he say to the churches, stand firm? But if you're going to stand firm, you got to stand up. You got to stand up and be heard. And so if the school is saying, we're not so sure about this speaker and so forth, that's when you can, in a winsome way, you don't have to raise your voice, say, perhaps even quietly, to the principal of the school or the school board member. Get to know your school board members. Get to know the city council, or at least one member of the city council, and then develop that relationship. Just as you love your neighbor, I love the idea of we really are to love our neighbor. Well, maybe that means having a cup of coffee with them and asking them into your home because we're not in lockdown anymore. I mean, once everyone is vaccinated, I understand cautions and common sense need to prevail. But here's an idea. Invite people over and say, "Hey, let me tell you about a book I'm reading." And tie it to something that's been in the news, because there's always going to be something in the news about. How about this for a very recent example? Our UN ambassador condemning the United States. How about our Secretary of State in Anchorage, Alaska, speaking boldly to his counterpart from China, and then allowing himself to be put on his hind feet and then giving rise to all this, oh, you're a bad nation and so forth. Look at this and look at that. No, we are a good nation. Bad things may happen, but we handle these things consistent with the rule of law. We do not, for starters, engage in genocide the way you are against the Uyghur Muslims. So you see where I'm going.
Yeah, definitely. Just sometimes those one-on-one conversations are much more productive than what might happen over social media or texting or some other medium. That
Yes.
face-to-face, that's where we can be like, oh, we really do have goodwill towards each other. I feel like we've gotten so distant this past year to actually be face-to-face with people. We remember, oh, I like that person. They're my friend. I don't have to try to read between the lines of their intentions if it's on text or somewhere, something like that. Face to face, you're going to actually have a tangible, hopefully a productive and helpful conversation. Ken, in terms of whether we're saying the conversation we just had or when readers get to the last page of the book, like what's that big takeaway? The one thing you hope every single person discovers from this message.
Be informed and stand firm for freedom and for the American exceptionalism that we believe in liberty, including religious liberty, our foundational freedom, those first 16 words of the Constitution.
And obviously, this book is available wherever great books are sold. But Ken, you have a special place you want to point us to pick up our own copy of the book. Where do we need to go to purchase our copy today?
Yes, I'm going to recommend a Christian bookstore in the Keystone State in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I don't have any ownership interest, but it's called heartsandmindsbooks.com. I'll repeat, hearts, your heart, and minds. We need to always use our minds as well as our heart.com. And it's a wonderful Christian owned bookstore.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have links in the show notes, places where you can find out more about Ken, and that link to where you can pick up your very own copy of his new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Ken Starr. Once again, our book today was Religious Liberty in Crisis, Exercising Your Faith in an Age of Uncertainty. For more on the book, a great place to start is heartandmindsbooks.com. Head on over, pick up your copy today. And Ken, I just want to say thank you for sharing with us today. It's been a pleasure. It's been an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. Take care.